I first noticed the photographs because they were boring. That was their defining feature. No dramatic captions, no warnings scribbled in margins. Just municipal plates, catalogue numbers, dates stamped in neat serif fonts, Hamburg, 1903, street surveys, building, facades, drainage corridors. The sort of material archivists file under infrastructure and forget about. I would have done the same if not for the windows. They sat too low, half swallowed by pavement. Brick frames sliced horizontally where sidewalks now ran, doorways that ended in stone, as though the city had simply risen and sealed them in place. Not collapsed, not demolished, buried, intact but unreachable. I checked the scale markers along the edges of the prints. Survey rods, measurement lines scratched into emulsion. Everything was proportioned correctly. The street level had been raised by more than a curb, more than resurfacing, enough to swallow storefronts. These were not sensational images that made them worse. They were administrative, routine. A clerk had logged them. A surveyor had measured them. Someone in a municipal office had approved the filing and moved on to the next task. I traced the stamp codes back to harbour authorities and public works departments. Same year, same districts, same handwriting styles across separate collections. Different photographers too, which mattered. It meant replication, not staging. When I asked an archivist how often material like this appeared, there was a pause. Papers rustled. Occasionally, came the answer. Occasionally, how? More silence. Enough to justify curiosity, not yet suspicion. I spread the prints across a table and noticed something else. Several bore annotations added later, new street names written over old ones, drainage lines rerouted, curbs sketched where doors once opened. Someone had redrawn the city after the photographs were taken, and these were only the first box. The city Hamburg claimed to be in 1903 was not mysterious. Shipyards crowded the Elbe, warehouses rose along canals in regimented rows. Rail lines stitched industrial districts to the port. Population records showed steady growth, not disruption. Municipal budgets tracked paving projects, sewer expansions, flood control embankments, harbor dredging. All of it ordinary that mattered. Cities undergoing catastrophe leave scars in paperwork long before they leave marks in stone. Emergency appropriations, temporary housing rosters, gaps in tax rolls, reconstruction committees. Hamburg's ledgers from the turn of the century were methodical and confident, the handwriting steady, the columns aligned. Street improvement schedules stretched across decades, plotted in predictable phases. I overlaid those schedules against the photographs. They did not line up. The resurfacing programs described thin layers of cobble and asphalt, curb adjustments measured in centimeters, drainage trenches dug and refilled within weeks. None accounted for pavements raised to window height. None mentioned ceiling entrances or abandoning lower floors wholesale. Harbor authorities appeared frequently in the archives. So did urban planning offices and sanitation boards. Their correspondents spoke in the language of engineering optimism, a city rationalizing itself through pipes and brickwork. The tone was incremental, not emergency-driven. Incremental projects do not swallow storefronts. I reread the memoranda, looking for urgency hidden between the lines. There was none. No flurry of directives, no sudden spikes in labor allocation, no extraordinary procurement orders for fill material. On the scale the photographs implied, the documents did not deny what I was seeing. They simply failed to acknowledge it. Somewhere between the ledgers and the street-level images, the city had changed shape. And whatever process had done it did not announce itself in the language administrators normally reserve for upheaval. Curiosity was no longer enough. Suspicion had started to organize itself. The next step was arithmetic, not theory, not interpretation. Numbers. I pulled engineering circulars from the same municipal departments whose stamps appeared on the photographs. Road resurfacing authorizations, sewer, trench permits, Street-level adjustment schedules filed quarter by quarter. They described stone bedding measured in handbreadths, asphalt courses poured in thin cliffs, curbstones raised a few centimeters to improve drainage after winter flooding. 9 meters. I began aligning dates. One document authorized resurfacing along a canal road in early spring. Another approved tramline reinforcement 6 months later. The photographs from that same corridor showed entrances sealed up to chest height, no intermediate images recorded, a transition, no reports mentioned, demolition crews removing facades, or merchants relocating below-grade storefront. Budgets added another layer of tension. Fill material appears in accounts when it is ordered in bulk. Transport costs spike. Labor rosters expand. Hamburg's ledgers remain steady. Stone deliveries matched maintenance, not transformation. Somewhere, crews had reshaped entire streets. On paper, they had not. I traced work orders through procurement chains, sand contracts, brick suppliers, wagon rentals, everything consistent with surface repair, nothing consistent with burial. Public works departments and construction crews remained faceless, reduced to signatures and expenditure codes, yet their absence was louder than their presence. They were responsible for every meter of roadway. They had recorded almost none of this. The gap was no longer visual, it was administrative, and it was growing. Once I stopped treating the first site as an anomaly, the pattern began to assemble itself. Harbor districts came first. Warehouses along canal edges where loading bays now sat below street level, accessed by staircases that descended into what had once been ground floor entrances. Municipal maps from the early 20th century showed building footprints unchanged while contour lines thickened around them, as if the earth itself had been redrawn upward. I moved inland. Residential blocks followed the same geometry, rows of brick facades whose lower courses disappeared beneath later paving. Arched windows sealed behind stone retaining walls, ventilation grills installed where display windows should have been. Survey sheets repeated the same symbols, regrid lines, elevation arrows, datum points anchored to earlier street levels and overridden with new ones. Different districts, different survey teams, identical results. Cartographers and municipal surveyors surfaced only through their handwriting at scale bars, but their collective work told a coherent story. The city had not been altered in a single corridor. It had been adjusted across neighborhoods. I layered the maps chronologically. The older plates formed a flatter profile. The newer ones climbed, block by block, until entire districts sat higher than their predecessors by amounts that refused to be ignored. Repetition erodes coincidence. The photographs no longer felt isolated. They felt coordinated. Beneath Hamburg's traffic routes and tram lines, beneath storefronts retrofitted into basements, beneath stairwells that descended into what should have been sidewalks, another city outline lingered. Older, lower, still legible if you knew where to look. By the time the pattern extended across multiple districts, the official explanations could no longer be avoided. Flood mitigation appeared first in municipal reports. The Elbe had always threatened low-lying neighborhoods, and Hamburg's engineers were proud of their embankments, pumping stations, and drainage corridors. Sewer modernization followed close behind, accompanied by carefully itemized plans for trenching, pipe replacement, and surface restoration. Street realignment projects rounded out the picture, justified by tram traffic and increasing commercial flow through the port. Taken individually, each program sounded sufficient. Taken together, they formed a narrative of steady improvement rather than upheaval. Council minutes spoke of gradual elevation changes to improve runoff. Engineering boards debated curb heights, gutter slopes, foundation reinforcement near canals. The tone was procedural, almost leisurely. No one wrote as though entire blocks were being entombed beneath new strata of earth and stone. I set those reports beside the photographs. The numbers refused to cooperate. Depth measurements in construction filings remained shallow. Timelines stretched across years instead of compressing into the kind of concentrated effort the streets implied. There were no emergency authorizations, no extraordinary appropriations, no language that suggested a city racing to bury what lay beneath its feet. Municipal councils and planning committees dominated the paper trail, not as villains, but as bureaucratic engines whose records defined what officially happened. What troubled me was not what they claimed. It was what their precision failed to contain. The explanations hovered close to adequacy without ever crossing into it. And that narrow gap was beginning to widen. I stopped reading policy language and turned back to the masonry itself. Brick courses stacked against former doorframes told a quieter story than any council ledger. In several photographs, mortar seams ran uninterrupted across what had once been entrances. Window arches terminated mid-curve, sealed by later stonework whose texture and coloration belonged to a different construction phase entirely. The alignment was not decorative. It was corrective, as if an older street level had been declared obsolete and overwritten rather than dismantled. Basement openings repeated the pattern. Grates designed for airflow now sat inches above pavement, their lower halves entombed. Sills rested below modern curb height, too low to function, too intact to suggest demolition. In certain corners, staircases descended directly into blank walls. I began charting the layering. Upper courses were uniform, municipal in style, consistent with early 20th century standards. Beneath them, the bricks varied in size, color, and bonding technique. Not crude, simply different. There were no marginal notes in the photographic catalogues explaining the transition, no engineering annotations, no geological surveys commenting on sudden sediment accumulation. The record showed surfaces being raised, but rarely explained what lay underneath. If archaeologists or geologists had been consulted, their conclusions did not survive in the archives I could locate. What remained were images and a silence where technical commentary should have been. Once the Hamburg material had been organized, its isolation became difficult to maintain. I began searching for parallel records elsewhere, not for proof, but for context. Port cities leave paper behind. Harbor authorities document dredging. Railway boards track street realignments. Insurance firms preserve elevation surveys after floods. Those archives, scattered across borders, often speak in similar technical dialects. In Rotterdam, I encountered photographs of quays whose lower warehouse doors had vanished beneath new stone embankments. In Antwerp, early 20th century street surveys recorded abrupt curb elevations paired with unexplained infill behind. Retaining walls. Genoa's waterfront renovation plans referenced surface normalization above districts whose original floor plans no longer aligned with the visible streetscape. Each case arrived with its own local justification. None arrived with commentary proportional to the architectural disruption they implied. Shipping consortia and customs offices appeared in the margins, commissioning upgrades to maintain cargo flow. National ministries signed off on harbor reinforcement budgets. The language repeated across languages, restrained, procedural, oddly uniform, and what unsettled me was not that cities altered themselves. It was that so many seemed to do so in comparable ways, within overlapping decades, leaving behind the same truncated entrances, submerged windows, and raised thoroughfares. Hamburg no longer felt singular. It felt representative, and representative data points rarely belong to small stories. Once the pattern stretched across borders, the archive itself began to feel different, not hostile, not obstructive, incomplete. In Hamburg's municipal catalogues, engineering folios ended mid-series. Sewer schematics jumped from draft to completion without intermediate calculations. Elevation surveys stopped just before the streets appeared to rise, then resumed years later with new baselines already assumed. The handwriting changed. Filing systems shifted. Cross-references pointed toward boxes that no longer existed. I traced catalog numbers through registry ledgers and found gaps where sequential volumes should have been. Procurement records reference structural works whose blueprints were absent. The correspondence between planning offices ended with polite closure rather than technical resolution. Archivists became part of the story without realizing it. "Those files should be here," one note in the margin read, penciled decades later by an unknown hand. Another simply listed a shelf location, followed by a line drawn through it. Historians writing secondary accounts rarely mentioned the missing material. They cited what survived and built outward. Careful, methodical, leaving the voids untouched. The absences were not dramatic. They were procedural, quiet, distributed, and yet, once noticed, they became difficult to ignore. Entire phases of urban transformation passed through paperwork without leaving the depth of documentation that comparable projects elsewhere demanded. No accusations formed, only an expanding perimeter around what could no longer be reconstructed. The city's transformation was visible in stone, but parts of its explanation had evaporated, and evaporation leaves residue. By this point, the material had begun to press toward a question I had deliberately postponed. Up to now, I had treated each anomaly in isolation. Photographs that contradicted street elevations, engineering reports whose numbers refused to align with physical depth, district-wide repetition, gaps in archival continuity. Each could, in theory, be explained separately. Taken together, they suggested something broader. I began sketching possibilities in the margins of my notes, not conclusions, only models that could accommodate the totality of what I was seeing. One of them appeared again and again in alternative, historical literature, usually presented with too much confidence and too little restraint. The idea of rapid urban burial beneath massive sediment deposits, followed by systematic rebuilding on top. I resisted the phrasing and focused on the mechanics. If a city experienced large-scale inundation by earth or slurry rather than water alone, street levels would rise abruptly, entrances would vanish without demolition, windows would be halved, older masonry would remain intact beneath newer courses. Infrastructure would be reset rather than repaired. Documentation would begin anew at a higher datum. That description did not prove anything. It did, however, fit the physical evidence more easily than resurfacing schedules spread across decades. What unsettled me was the implication such an event would not be local. It would not be minor, and it would require a revision of how modern European cities remembered their own recent past. I kept the hypothesis provisional, but once articulated, it refused to leave. The investigation eventually returned to where it had begun. Modern Hamburg moves efficiently across its surfaces. Trams slide over asphalt that conceals older curb lines. Pedestrians pass storefronts whose windows begin uncomfortably close to the pavement. Their proportions slightly wrong if one stops long enough to notice. Doorways sit a step below street grade, framed by stone that once assumed a different relationship to the world outside. Those details no longer felt incidental. They felt inherited. What unsettled me was not that cities change. All cities do. What lingered was how rarely these lower layers entered public conversation, how seldom plaques or planning summaries acknowledged a previous urban horizon beneath the present one. Renovations were described, restorations catalogued, elevations adjusted. Earlier ground levels remained implied rather than examined. The records that survived carried us to a point and then dissolved. The photographs showed consequences without process. Engineering summaries began after whatever transformation required explanation had already passed. I stood with a sense that Hamburg's streets were not simply built atop foundations. They were built atop decisions whose full context no longer circulated. Perhaps explanations still exist, scattered across forgotten repositories or private collections. Perhaps they do not. Either way, the pavement keeps its silence, and beneath it, an older city waits without commentary, supporting the present while refusing to speak for itself.